Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
In this video, we are going to discuss how teachers can guide their students to enhance their employability in a highly competitive world through the development of English language skills or language skills in general. So, learning English in order to increase one's chances in terms of getting employed has become a commonplace strategy in the Indian context. What one has to do in order to find the perfect job and earn money is to learn and master English. In other words, learning English is seen as a potentially rewarding return on investment. Now, this opinion is quite widespread. This objective propels the language teaching policies into the educational context, and it is motivated particularly by the idea of a productive workforce in a global market. Now, language learning and language competences are therefore reconfigured in terms of investment, that is, individual, institutional, or societal investments, in terms of financial resources, time, and energy for the development of language competences that can be turned into economic profit. Now, against the backdrop of discourse, we argue that the conversion of investment into profit is far from coming about automatically for everyone or for every language. We wonder, for example, what happens to migrants and their multilingual competences, especially when evaluated against competences in the logically dominant language. As it happens, any linguistic competence is valued every so often against competences in the local language, marking speakers as competent or deficient, irrespective of their overall linguistic repertoire. Moreover, while it is difficult to assess concisely the importance of language competences for individual professional success stories, it seems informative to contextualize the question of conversion potential of language competences in the framework of unemployment, especially when we compare it with other factors like personal networks, professional qualifications, and soft skills. After all, unemployment is one of those exemplary moments where the potential conversion is highly contested and put to proof. The correlation of language investment, employability, and professional success therefore warrants a critical and empirical investigation in relation to the complex social, political, and economic processes through which training in English becomes valued and recognized. Under which conditions, in which contexts, and for whom does language investment actually constitute a key element for employability? Now, language investment and employability in political economic terms needs to be scrutinized in a perspective that understands individuals as embedded in specific socio-political, economic, and institutional structures. The economic underpinnings of the concept investment becomes evident when considering its general and most basic meaning: to invest time, money, or some other resource with the expectation of benefits that is of a certain return on the investment. Now, the decision to invest in learning English is always made with the idea that it will pay off in the future, and refigures the object of investment, that is language learning, as something with a certain potential. From this perspective, language competences become human capital per se, that is, individual knowledge components or simply skills. Actually, it appears as though language can be considered as two different forms of skills, as belonging to soft skills when communication competences are at stake, or as belonging to hard skills when a certain level of language competence is demanded for a certain position or connection. Now, the connection between language and investment has already been studied in a variety of contexts. Language economists have dedicated the bulk of their research to study the economic effect of language investment and language competences. Therefore, it also perceives those investments and competences as part and parcel of the human capital. Now, Chiswick, for example, studied the income level of the immigrant population in Australia and the United States with respect to their English language competences. Even if they experience discrimination with regard to their salaries, Chiswick concluded that it was economically profitable for immigrants to learn the locally dominant language, which is English. Williams, on the other hand, calculated the positive impact of multilingual competences on the salaries of workers in Western Europe. Now, in general, these researchers are in agreement on a positive effect of language-related competences for highly qualified staff in Europe, with English playing the most important role. However, there is also another direction that research has on language investment and competences in relation to the direction taken by the economy, most importantly by scholars ascribing to an approach grounded in critical ethnographic sociolinguistics. These scholars have an interest in how the political economic transformations that are a characteristic of the globalized new economy are affecting work processes, the formation of competitive markets, and socio-political regulations on a very general level, and more specifically the role of languages in these processes. Now, the new economy is generally understood as the current phase of capitalism, which is the result of a transition from an agricultural and industrial production to a service industry that centers on knowledge and technology. It has been argued that in this process, language has been turned into a veritable resource, since a variety of related services are based on communication, both written and oral. Further, this necessitates specialized trainings, for example, the increased importance of globalized business communication and client services, critically the call centers, as well as human resource processes. Now, such transformations naturally not only affect institutions and businesses, but most importantly the language users per se, that is, the workforce subtly, also referred to as the word force by Heller. In this context, investment emerges as one central element in relation with economic appropriation of language competences and practices. Critical scholars are analyzing the investment of the state into the language education of its students, that is, the future workforce. Now, in the Indian context, this is true for language training in English and the amount of investment that even the students put into it. There is further investment of the business houses and the multinational corporations in further training of the language skills of its employees, or rather, actually in preferring to employ individuals that already bring these skills with them, and thus personally the required bundle of skills. Now, according to Bourdieu's theory of capital, language can be considered as part of the symbolic capital. The linguistic capital, however, has its own specific value on a particular linguistic market, depending on the situation, the participants, and social hierarchy. When departing from the idea that the labor market is in fact an integrated market in a specific political economic entity, it becomes clear that different languages are attributed different value, composing a dynamic hierarchy of languages and the speakers of those languages. Now, in the Indian social and employment context, both public and private, proficiency in English as well as communication skills in English are the deciding factors. Even socially, the behavioral trends of people favor alignment and agreement with fluent speakers of English, and the aspirational frameworks of students reflect the tendency to improve in terms of accent, lexical choices, as well as communication channels to be identifiable with a certain group of English language users. It becomes clear that not all investment in language education is deemed of similar worth, even if the celebratory discourses on language skills as a key element to regain access and recognition in the workplace directly lead to a generally positive framing of language as a good investment. Now, Bourdieu reminds to be careful about celebrations of linguistic glorification and capitalization, as these mostly link only certain languages with symbolic capital. The application of Bourdieu's concept of resource and capital to English language learning in the Indian employability context is highly relevant when we take into account the considerable amount of resources going into the learning processes. That is on one hand, and the discourses of social mobility connected to language learning on the other hand. Norton has argued that language learning needs to be resituated in the larger social frameworks that surround the learner. It is equally important to note how investment in Norton's terms becomes closely and exclusively tied with identity construction. In this perspective, this concept most importantly positions that an investment in the target language is also an investment in a learner's own social identity, an identity which is constantly changing across time and space. But conditions and constraints related to language learning are not only related to the social world of the individual language learners, but more to the broader political economic regimes. The financing of programs, problem solutions, or specific groups of people is only undertaken on the basis of the expectation of return on investment. This is connected to the increasing implementation of an audit culture from the private sector to the public sector, which has led to a need to account for and legitimize public spending. So, the current public discourse on language competences is pivotal for professional success, and it results in an association of language competences as a central aspect of employability. The interplay between investment and employability becomes highlighted in the context of employment and its corresponding policies. I hope that the points that I discussed here have been helpful in understanding how employability and language competence are related, and how language training influences one's employability. I wish you all a great time in the classroom. Thank you.